Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6. This editorial deals with the new strategic disinvestment policy that was announced in the latest budget. See, disinvestment is nothing but the sale of government shareholdings or the sale of the government stakes which are held in public sector units or public sector enterprises. Through the process of disinvestment, the government reduces its shareholding in PSUs, and it could even push for complete privatization of the PSUs. To handle the disinvestment process, a dedicated department has been set up under the Ministry of Finance known as DIPAM, which stands for Department for Investment and Public Asset Management. The proceeds of disinvestment not only fetches precious revenue to the government, but it also enables the privatization of public sector units, especially the loss-making companies, which is seen as a major economic reform. See, the story of India's public sector dates back to the initial years following India's independence. After becoming independent, the Indian economy was staring at a massive crisis with little or no capabilities in most of the critical sectors. So India, which was inspired by the socialist model of development of the Soviet Union, decided to adopt the planned model of development under the 5-year plans. During that era, this was considered to be the right move for India, considering the lack of capabilities in the private sector to trigger economic growth. So this led India to adopt a state-led model of development, which in turn led to the establishment of several large public sector undertakings, and eventually these PSUs would emerge as the backbone of the Indian economy. So this led the government-run and government-funded PSUs to dominate every sector of the economy, and very soon government PSUs were seen to be involved in defense production, extraction of minerals, running hotels, running airlines, and even manufacturing watches. So basically, from end to end, most of the basic needs of the economy were being met by these large government-run PSUs. In the initial decades, this approach definitely helped in triggering economic activity, and it also served a larger public purpose by creating secure jobs, especially for the lower and middle classes in India, and it also went on to trigger a host of other related economic activities. But as India's experiment with socialism started to fail, many of these PSUs became highly inefficient and they became the symbol of corruption. Except for a few success stories, many of these PSUs turned into loss-making enterprises. Despite the failure of several PSUs, the government kept funding some of these companies by keeping in mind the larger public purpose that they were serving. This was not only a huge drain on the government's resources, but it was also an inefficient way of running a business. Even though there was no economic rationale in running these loss-making companies, the government continued to fund them and it continued to hold a majority stake in these companies because the question of job security of lakhs of PSU workers eventually became an issue of electoral politics. Then as we entered the era of 1980s and 1990s, a new revolutionary theory had started to come up in the field of public administration. This was the era of NPM or New Public Management, which believed in the minimal role of the government in the economy. So around the world, developed countries started shifting towards this model, and it was widely accepted that the government has no business being in business. It basically meant that the government shouldn't be involved in running hotels or airlines, or it shouldn't be involved in producing watches and bread. Instead, the role of the government should be like a catalyst or an enabler for creating the right platform for the private sector and the private investors to take over all the manners of production and businesses. Because the inherent nature of government bureaucracy and government hierarchy had resulted in a significant slowdown in decision making, and it had also become a breeding ground for corruption and inefficiency, especially with regard to the management of the PSUs. So by early 1990s, India was staring at a grave economic crisis in the form of the BOP crisis or the balance of payments crisis. And this led the Narasimha Rao government, led by Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, to abandon the socialist model of development and adopt LPG reforms. These landmark economic reforms helped in liberalizing the Indian economy, and it also paved the way for privatization and globalization. So the renewed thinking in the government was that the government should start exiting these businesses, especially loss-making businesses, and pave the way for the private sector to take over so that more efficiency can be brought in with better expertise and better managerial practices from the private sector. So thus began the journey of India's disinvestment, and several PSUs were lined up for the disinvestment process. So through this process over the years, the government has reduced its stakeholding in several PSUs, and many PSUs have been privatized as well. This disinvestment process fetches precious non-tax revenue to the government, which in turn could be used for funding socio-economic welfare programs, and at the same time it could help in reviving some of the inefficient loss-making PSUs by bringing in efficient managerial practices from the outside. But however, the process of disinvestment has always faced a lot of resistance with regard to implementation. Since the 1990s, subsequent governments, they have lined up multiple PSUs for disinvestment, and they have announced very ambitious plans in every budget. But each time, these ambitious plans hit a roadblock due to poor execution of the disinvestment process from the government, and also because of resistance and electoral pressure from the workers and the employees. Till date, some of the major disinvestments have happened following the 91-92 reforms introduced by the Narasimha Rao government, and then it was followed up by the Vajpayee government, which managed to disinvest several PSUs. So the editorial points out that the latest announcement of a new strategic disinvestment policy in the recent budget marks the biggest step in disinvestment and economic reforms since the decade of the 1990s. In the recent budget, the Finance Minister has announced that the government is planning to realize at least 1.75 lakh crore rupees as non-tax revenue for the government through its disinvestment proceeds. Accordingly, the government has proposed a strategic sale of few PSUs, and the most likely candidates could be Air India and BPCL. In the budget, the Finance Minister has also announced the IPO listing of LIC, along with a proposal to privatize at least 2 public sector banks and 1 general insurance company. These disinvestment plans of the government are in line with the Atmanirbhar Bharat vision that has been laid down by the Prime Minister, and the government has made it clear that in the coming years it would be exiting all the non-strategic sectors. So in a few strategic sectors, the government would like to maintain a bare minimum presence, and broadly these sectors would include security and defense related sectors such as atomic energy, space, defense, and a few other crucial sectors such as transport and telecom, power, petroleum, coal and other minerals, banking and finance, etc. In these sectors listed as strategic, the government would like to maintain only a bare minimum presence to serve the larger strategic purpose with regard to the country's defense. But apart from that, it plans to exit from all the non-strategic sectors. So the sale and closure of loss-making PSUs has dual advantages. It not only brings in revenue to the government, but it would also help in saving precious government resources and as well as the taxpayers' money, which in turn could be used for other productive areas. But however, the success of this ambitious plan lies entirely on its execution. As the editorial points out, there is going to be resistance against these disinvestment plans from a few expected pockets such as workers and trade unions. But despite this resistance and pressure, the government will have to go ahead with the disinvestment plan, and in the process, it has to ensure that the well-being of the workers is also taken care of. Currently, the market conditions are absolutely perfect for disinvestment, but however, it will have to keep in mind the impact of the pandemic, because the pandemic has affected the financial capabilities of several institutions, especially the private sector, and this could dampen the spirit of the investors in bidding for the government stocks. And the government will also have to ensure that the disinvestment process causes the least possible disruption to the economy, and it will also have to keep the process as transparent as possible in order to avoid any allegations of corruption, which could end up triggering unnecessary audits and investigation, and this could completely derail the disinvestment plans of the government. So in this context, the editorial praises the Modi government for initiating these economic reforms, even though it comes a little delayed, and it reminds the government that the success of the policy will lie in its execution. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6 that deals with the topic of trans fat. See, trans fat is a type of unsaturated fat that is found in food items. It occurs both naturally and it is also produced in the industry. The natural occurrence of trans fat is reported in red meat and dairy products, especially from the ruminant category of animals. This includes sheep, goats, cows, etc. And they naturally produce trans fat when the bacteria in their gut is digesting the grass that they would have eaten. Then artificial trans fat refers to the trans fat that is produced in the industry, that is in the food processing industry. So in the food processing industry, vegetable oils, they are industrially altered or chemically altered to store them in solid form at room temperatures in order to increase their shelf life. Plus, it is also believed that the usage of vegetable oils containing trans fat is also likely to increase the taste of the product. But however, the long-term consumption of trans fat, that too in large quantities, is a major health hazard. Because studies have clearly established that the consumption of trans fat increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases and as well as the risk of cancer. The studies also point out that the consumption of natural trans fat in the form of red meat and dairy products is not harmful to human beings, and it does not constitute a health risk as long as the consumption is in moderate quantities. But the real risk to human health comes from the large consumption of artificial trans fat that is produced in the industry, and its long-term consumption, that too in large quantities, is going to alter the lipid cholesterol profile. Trans fat is known to have a direct impact on the levels of HDL and LDL in our body, and it negatively affects the lipid cholesterol profile. The consumption of trans fat is known to reduce the HDL levels, which are considered as good cholesterol, and it is known to increase the LDL levels, which are considered as the bad cholesterol. So this in turn significantly increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases and as well as cancer. Even in those fats and oils which are known to have lesser trans fat content, it has been shown that the trans fat content is going to increase significantly if the same fat or oil is reused repeatedly, that too at higher temperatures. Because this alters the chemical composition of the fat or the oil, and it results in a direct increase in the trans fat content. So considering the serious health risk posed by the consumption of trans fat, the World Health Organization has laid out a global goal for achieving a trans fat free world by 2023. And the focus of this WHO campaign is on elimination of industrial trans fat. According to the WHO, if the fat or the oil which is being used in cooking, if it contains more than 1% trans fat content, then it significantly increases the health risk. But however, it has been widely accepted that limiting the trans fat content to 2% in the industrial fats and oils which are used in cooking is sufficient to contain the risk of heart disease and cancer. Initially, when the health risk posed by trans fat became clear, several countries around the world, including developed countries, were hesitant to cap the trans fat content because they were worried about its economic impact on the food processing industries. However, Denmark became the first country to limit trans fat content to 2% in 2004, and within 3 years, Denmark started noticing a significant improvement in its health indicators. After limiting trans fat content to 2%, Denmark started noticing a significant reduction in deaths associated with cardiovascular diseases. It reported that such deaths went down by 14 per 1 lakh population. So when Denmark initially introduced this policy, there was a lot of resistance amongst other European countries because of its possible economic impact on the food processing industries. But however, after realizing the health risk posed by trans fat, even the European Union brought out a policy in 2019, and it has restricted the trans fat content to 2% in all the food products that are being sold within the European Union. In the case of India, the institution that is responsible for regulating the food items in the interest of human health is the FSSAI, or the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. Even the FSSAI took into account the health impact of consuming trans fat, and in 2016 it brought out a policy to restrict the trans fat content in food products being produced in India from 10% to 5%. Recently, in December 2020, this limit was further brought down to 3%, and the food processing industries will have to comply by these limits by the end of this year. Now, in order to fast track India's progress towards achieving this goal of the World Health Organization, the FSSAI has again notified that the trans fat content should be limited to 2% by January 2022. This puts India in the same league as that of the developed countries of Europe, and it puts India on the path of eliminating trans fat from industrial food items. The best part about India's policy is that it targets all kinds of industrial trans fat, including fat and oil, and as well as emulsions such as margarine. Margarine is used in the food processing industry as the equivalent of butter, and it is known to contain very high levels of trans fatty acids. So with this updated policy of India against trans fats, the time has come for the food processing industries in the country to start adopting the much healthier alternatives and substitutes that are readily available. And the best part is that these alternatives and substitutes that are available, they come with no additional cost or changes in the taste of the food product. So this advantage, accompanied with the policy of the FSSAI, should push the Indian food processing industries towards eliminating trans fat. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with the POCSO Act of 2012. POCSO stands for Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. As the name itself indicates, the purpose of this legislation is to protect children who are under the age of 18 years from sexual assault. This Act of India is in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which India had ratified in 1992. As per the UN Convention, the countries are required to define sexual exploitation and sexual abuse against children as heinous crimes, and along with providing explicit definition of various kinds of sexual assault, the respective national laws should also provide for the strictest of punishment in order to establish a strong deterrence against the sexual exploitation and abuse of minor children. So this law of India is a landmark legislation as far as protecting minor children from sexual offences is concerned. But in a shocking development, recently the Bombay High Court passed a very controversial verdict in the Satish Ranade case. In this case, the Bombay High Court acquitted the accused by stating that the accused had only groped the victim over her clothes and there was no skin-to-skin contact. The accused in this particular case was held guilty of groping the minor victim, but just because there was no skin-to-skin contact, the Bombay High Court decided to acquit the accused. Now, this flawed ruling of the Bombay High Court was a direct result of some of the shortcomings in the POCSO Act. But rightfully, the Supreme Court stepped in and it has stayed the order because the Supreme Court took note of the narrow interpretation of the POCSO Act that was applied by the Bombay High Court. See, Section 7 of the POCSO Act deals with any attempt to touch the breast of a child with sexual intent, and it classifies this act as a sexual assault. Then Section 8 of the POCSO Act provides very stringent punishment for the sexual assault with 3 years of imprisonment. For such incidents of groping, even section 354 of the IPC can be invoked, which deals with outraging the modesty of women, and it provides for a punishment of 1 year in jail. See, when it comes to sexual assault, the key differences between the Indian Penal Code and the POCSO is that POCSO provides for explicit definition of sexual assault, whereas under IPC, the definitions are more generic. Because the term outraging the modesty of women is open to interpretation under the IPC, whereas under POCSO, specific acts have been listed out, which includes the touching or groping of any private parts of a minor child with sexual intent. And it also covers any other act which involves physical contact without penetration. See, under POCSO, the definition of sexual assault deliberately excludes rape because it requires penetration. And other than that, the scope of sexual assault under POCSO is much wider than that of the Indian Penal Code. And as far as the rape of a minor child is concerned, POCSO provides for a separate explicit definition. And when it comes to sexual assault, another key difference between IPC and POCSO is that the coverage of the law depending on the age of the victim. The provisions of POCSO is meant to protect children against sexual offences, that is minor children, whereas the relevant provisions of the IPC applies for any victim of any age. But under POCSO, very strict punishment has been provided for in order to establish a strong deterrence with regard to sexual offences and sexual assault against minor children. So this being the case, the Bombay High Court should have considered a wider interpretation of the provisions of POCSO by keeping in mind the importance of protecting children from sexual offences and sexual exploitation. Even the Supreme Court has made this stand very clear in the landmark Vishaka case of 1997. Through the Vishaka case, the Supreme Court laid down the framework for preventing sexual harassment at workplace. While looking into this case, the Supreme Court had clearly observed that outraging the modesty of women should not be treated as a trivial matter, and even if the existing laws do not have specific provisions, a wider interpretation should be adopted in order to deliver the strictest of punishments. Through several other judgments, the judiciary has clearly established that any contact or criminal assault with sexual intent should be treated as a sexual offence. In fact, in the United Kingdom, the Sexual Offences Act of 2003 goes on to say that any groping or touching of any body part with sexual intent should be treated as a sexual offence. When you compare this with the POCSO Act, the only shortcoming is that its explicit definitions covers only the touching or groping of private parts, and hence it can be argued that it doesn't provide for wider coverage. But however, these shortcomings in the legislation shouldn't become an excuse to go easy on the accused, especially when the accused has been held guilty of the assault, and especially when the cases involve minor victims. It is in this context that the writer is calling upon the judiciary to provide for wider interpretation wherever needed in order to guarantee additional protection to children against sexual offences. Now let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: the strategic disinvestment policy unveiled in the recent budget is a belated but definitely a bold step. Do you agree? Examine how the execution of the policy will be critical for realizing targeted revenues. The second question: healthier substitutes to trans fat are now available. So discuss the need for eliminating trans fat from processed food by highlighting the efforts being made in India and as well as around the world. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.